Greetings, friends, and mostly enemies. Today, we're diving into something a bit more serious, a bit more meaty, and forever relevant than some of the typical stuff I do on this channel. We're talking about the art of war. If you've never heard of the art of war, wow, okay. But if you've never heard of the art of war, it's a famous analysis of the principles of warfare, an outlining of the principles of warfare by a Chinese philosopher by the name of Sun Tzu. There's a lot that you could go into, a lot of branch conversations you could have about this work. As you can see, it's not very meaty. This is not much of a book, and a lot of the pages in here are not fully, none of them are fully occupied. You see the writing is done in this style right here throughout, and there's a lot of art, okay, to pad the page count, I think, and to make it a little bit more meaty for the American consumer. But the fact of the matter is that there is a plethora of information in here, and this book has inspired countless military geniuses. It continues to be studied by military minds, and it remains one of the most relied upon and studied treatises on the conduct of war. So, we're going to dig into this, and I'm going to give you some of my thoughts, some stuff right out of the book. Hopefully, by the end, you understand war, and for that matter, human beings a little bit better. Alright, let's go. I do want to start off with a quick primer discussion about the very existence of the art of war, and a little bit about the author, Sun Tzu, and the people who have translated this work faithfully from the original Chinese. So for those of you who do not know, Tzu is actually an honorific title. So that means that Sun Tzu's name translated would actually mean Master Sun. However, this was not the only name he was known by. In his time, there's also some record that he may have been known as Sun Wu. However, many think that this was less an actual title and more of a nickname, as he was both from the region of Wu. In the later part of his life, he migrated there due to war, and Wu also translates to military. Sun Tzu would end up being called Sun Tzu after he originally fled from his home province, where at the time he was called Chang Ching, and I hope I'm getting that name right. I swear I'm not trying to butcher it or be disrespectful. That's, as best I can tell, that's how you would pronounce that. Chang Ching. Because of the conflict happening in his home province, he fled to the province of Wu. When Sun arrived in the province of Wu, he was brought to the attention of the ruler because of this collection of military doctrine. To test his ability to lead troops, the ruler of Wu put Sun in charge of a collection of his concubines. Sun made the emperor's, or not the emperor at the time, but the ruler of the province's concubines. He made the two favorite concubines the leaders of two separate divisions. He then attempted to drill them. When given orders the first time, they laughed. Sun said, if a general cannot lead his troops, it is the general's fault. He gave them commands again. They laughed again. The general said, if a general gives clear and concise commands and they are not followed, it is the fault of his lieutenants. He beheaded the division leaders, the ruler's two favorite concubines, and assigned new division leaders. After that, the concubines fell into perfect command, thus proving to the ruler of Wu that Sun could in fact command troops. Interestingly enough, there is contention about whether or not this account actually took place. as well as whether or not Sun Tzu actually existed. However, a leading scholar on Chinese philosophy and Sun Tzu, Lionel Giles, has compiled a very compelling case, one that I agree with, that the Art of War was in fact written by a Chinese master strategist by the name of Sun Tzu. This account that I just relayed to you, as well as his period where he immigrated to the province of Wu, would have taken place sometime 512 to 505 BC. While there may be some contention about whether or not Sun Tzu was in fact a real person, again, I do truly maintain that he was. It only makes sense to me, and having read this, I can tell you the language is consistent. This does not feel like it was written by multiple authors, and that leads me personally to have an informed opinion that Sun Tzu was, in fact, a real-life, legendary master of war. So, with that little bit of introductory information out of the way, let's start talking about the actual contents of Sun Tzu's work. We start with Chapter 1, Laying Plans, and it is, of course, exactly about that. Laying plans and the principles thereof as Sun Tzu outlines them. Sun Tzu had a very particular way of doing most of his things and a very structured manner of thinking. Sun Tzu outlines the principles of laying plans as such. Principle 1, the moral law. Principle 2, heaven. 3, earth. 4, the commander. 5, method and discipline. He describes the moral law as causes the people to be in complete accord with their ruler, so that they will follow him regardless of their lives, undismayed by any danger. He describes heaven as night and day, heat and cold, time and seasons, so nature. Earth is distance, danger and security, open ground and narrow passes, the chance of life and death. The commander stands for the virtues of wisdom, sincerity, benevolence, courage, and strictness. Method and discipline are to be understood as the marshalling of the army in its proper subdivisions, the graduations of rank among the officers, the maintenance of roads by which supplies may reach the army, and the control of military expenditure. So you can see that Sun Tzu had a very structured way of thinking about how to go about doing things. He knew what terms he thought in, and he had very clear definitions of those terms. This was a man who thought analytically and who structured his thoughts so that everything was sequential and clean. Sun Tzu goes on to make it abundantly clear how to apply these principles when laying your plans. He says, "Therefore, in your deliberations, when seeking to determine the military conditions, let them be made the basis of comparison in this wise. Which of the two sovereigns is imbued with the moral law? Which of the two generals has most ability? With whom lie the advantages derived from heaven and earth? On which side is discipline most rigorously enforced? Which army is stronger? On which side are officers and men more highly trained? In which army is there the greater consistency in both reward and punishment?" Sun Tzu was very concerned with how war is conducted from the ground to the very top of the war machine. He spoke at length about the condition of your troops, whether or not they are fed, whether or not their morale is high, how to keep their morale high, and other things of that nature. There is one more noteworthy passage in Chapter 1, a passage which is echoed throughout the book. Passage 17 of Chapter 1, "All warfare is based on deception." While Chapter 2 does have other bits of information and does discuss other matters, one of the chief things discussed is the financials and logistics of war. Sun Tzu cautions the reader that lengthy, drawn-out campaigns are sure to bankrupt an empire. He refers to whatever is funding the war machine as the state. And he assures you that the purpose of warfare is to go in, break, and destroy the enemy as expediently as possible and extract all of his value. Sun Tzu said in this chapter, "Supreme excellence is in breaking the enemy without fighting." He went on to emphasize as part of that point that the foolishness of siege is that it lays waste to your own armies often just as much as the enemy wastes time and resources, etc. And he went on to outline 4 much better strategies, which I will not get into in the interest of keeping the video relatively reasonable in length. You can, of course, always go read the work yourself, which I think you should. Also, in honor of what's going on in the world right now, and the bumbling moron-in-chief in the White House, I would like to address this specific passage to former Vice President Joe Jackass. There are 3 ways in which a ruler can bring misfortune upon his army. By commanding the army to advance or retreat, Afghanistan, being ignorant of the fact that it cannot obey. This is called hobbling the army. By attempting to govern an army in the same way as he administers a kingdom, very fucking poorly. Being ignorant of the conditions which obtain in an army. This causes restlessness in the soldiers' minds. By employing the officers of his army without discrimination. Through ignorance of the military principle of adaptation to circumstances. This shakes the confidence of the soldiers. What does Sun Tzu mean by without discrimination? Sun Tzu means by not being discerning and picky about who you put in charge or allow into the military in general. In other words, admission into the military should be a meritocracy. So saith the Sage of War. To secure ourselves against defeat lies in our own hands, but the opportunity of defeating the enemy is provided by the enemy himself. In Chapter 4, Sun Tzu concerns himself with the guiding principles of when and when not to attack, and he talks a good deal about what makes a good fighter, a smart fighter. Sun Tzu also says, "The consummate leader cultivates the moral law and strictly adheres to method and discipline. Thus, it is in his power to control success." Indirect tactics, efficiently applied, are inexhaustible as heaven and earth, unending as the flow of rivers and streams. Like the sun and moon, they end but to begin anew. Like the 4 seasons, they pass away to return once more. Chapter 5 concerns itself with the philosophy and mindset of a commander, how a commander thinks, and the way he addresses the energy, the essence of war. Chapter 6 is largely complemented by the following chapter, Maneuvers. The main focus of Chapter 6 being when and where to attack the enemy, how to discern when and where to attack the enemy, and, of course, not leaving weak points open when you move forces to attack the enemy. This is, of course, done through crafty maneuvering and a little bit of deception. In Chapter 7, we get some more nitty-gritty, but mostly a continuation of focus on guiding principle where maneuvering is concerned. I want to read you this passage and then go right from my notes because I wrote a significant amount of notation for this chapter. Let your plans be dark and impenetrable as night, and when you move, fall like a thunderbolt. So we see that Master Sun had a penchant for the poetic. Also of note in this chapter is the continued citing of do's and don'ts, which I have not previously talked about very much, but there's a fair good bit of outlining of do's and do-nots in this book. As a means of illustrating the principles Sun wishes to impress upon the reader. Many of these principles have to do with the logistical realities of moving armies and the wear and tear they sustain when moving any significant distance. Also discussed is the importance of knowing when and when not to pursue the enemy. Sun gives a specific example on page 108, which is as follows. When you surround an army, leave an outlet free. Do not press a desperate foe too hard. Such is the art of warfare. Basically, wounded animal in a corner will do anything to get out. Which is something that he continues to talk about as being a principle of how armies behave later in the book as well. This chapter acts as a what we have covered so far sort of chapter, with some cross-principle examples, briefly discussing how some of the principles interact and how they must be weighed against one another to optimize their use in any given situation. Also mentioned are the 5 critical faults of a general, as shown here on page. Now, something that I have not noted until now, but I want to get out really quick. Whenever you see a bolded passage with Chinese characters on the opposite page, that is the English translation of those Chinese characters. This chapter opens with discussions of dealing with various kinds of terrain, and here we see the first glint of what may have been some form of humor from Sun Tzu. We see this on page 118, and he repeats this phrase, "so much for," with multiple examples of terrain and when not to fight in them. This chapter also contains signs of deteriorating morale and command, what to look for to gauge an enemy's readiness, how to know when they are coming, going, attacking, or bluffing. While specific examples are given, as always, what is more important is the principle behind them. Look for signs and learn to interpret them correctly. This will tell you everything about the enemy and your own army. Therefore, soldiers must be treated in the first instance with humanity, but kept under control by means of iron discipline. This is a certain road to victory. Predictably, this section goes into greater detail into the usage of terrain, but actually does not focus solely on that. Later in the chapter, we get some increased insights into generalship and the art of command, as outlined in this passage. Now, an army is exposed to 6 calamities, not arising from natural causes, but from faults for which the general is responsible. These are flight, insubordination, collapse, ruin, disorganization, and rout. Sun Tzu was very concerned with making sure that his generals, above all else, were taking responsibility for how the army was conducted and doing a damn fine job. However, Sun also did not let soldiers off the hook when it came to the overall condition of the army, chastising undisciplined soldiers, comparing them to spoiled children, and saying they are, quote, useless. He sums up the entire chapter quite nicely in the final passage here. Hence the saying, if you know the enemy and know yourself, your victory will not stand in doubt. If you know heaven and know earth, you may make your victory complete. In Chapter 9, Sun Tzu outlines different types of terrain, once again showing his analytical mind and the way he chooses to structure his discussion of warfare by being very specific about what types of terrain you are on. And I don't want you to think like rocky or muddy or hill or cave. Think more so terrain that you can easily access, whether or not it's blockaded by the enemy. Terrain that is inside your own borders, terrain that's inside your allies' borders. These are the kinds of terms Sun was speaking in. He taught his commanders to analyze terrain in these terms and whether or not they could use it and what kind of terrain it was determined how strategies were laid down. These are the principles of proper usage of terrain. He gives a great example of the overall principle here in a very succinct yet brilliant summary. If asked how to cope with a great host of the enemy in orderly array and on the point of marching to the attack, I should say, begin by seizing something which your opponent holds dear. Then he will be amenable to your will. He goes on to say, rapidity is the essence of war. Take advantage of the enemy's unreadiness, make your way by unexpected routes, and attack unguarded spots. I believe he summarizes the entire chapter in those two sections quite well. Chapter 12, Attack by Fire, is exactly what it sounds like. He outlines the principles of how to use fire in combat, common sense stuff about how fire behaves, when and when not to use it, and general stuff like that. Now, as someone who has quite a bit of experience with fire and being burned, I can tell you, yeah, everything in The Sound of War is pretty sound advice on how to deal with fire. I bet Sun Tzu and Elon Musk would have been good buddies. And finally, in Chapter 13, exactly what you would think, we get a brief introduction on the concept of spies and how to properly use them. The final passage of The Art of War is actually a very good summary of the section on spies. Hence, it is only the enlightened ruler and the wise general who will use the highest intelligence of the army for purposes of spying, and thereby they achieve great results. Spies are a most important element in warfare because on them depends an army's ability to move. So, in that context, Sun Tzu isn't so much talking about secret agent James Bond types, but more so battlefield scouts, people you would maybe think of as like army rangers and those kinds of folks, people who gather in raw intelligence on the ground. Not so much the James Bond type of spy that we've been, conditioned to associate that word with. However, he did also mean a little bit of the James Bond kind of spies. People that would infiltrate enemy camps, infiltrate enemy government, and get information. Sun Tzu impressed the importance of maintaining a good spy network. Because again, deception is the art of warfare. Hey guys, if you enjoyed this analysis and discussion of the art of war, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button, hit the like button, and leave a comment. Let me know what you thought. Let me know if there's anything you'd like me to discuss more in depth about this, or other classic works you'd like me to talk about. I'm always interested in doing that kind of stuff. If you like slice of life, reaction content, or just want to see my personality shine through in all of its ridiculous glory, you can check out our second channel, IYFA. If you want to see the Saturday show where we critique literature, read poetry, and do some performance art, you can check out Adventurous Publications, where we upload the live show that is now going live on Twitch as a trial run. We might move it back to YouTube depending on how the trial run over there goes. We'll see. But we are still going to be on Twitch regardless of whether or not the show stays there, doing other kinds of streaming because we just like being on camera. And of course, you guys know that I am a writer myself. You can check out The Garden of Lies at Barnes & Noble's, Amazon for the time being. I have a feeling it won't be on there forever. and other various retailers. And of course, its sequel, and The Garden of Fate, the third book. Bo, what is wrong, boy? Huh? What is wrong? What is wrong, you silly mutt? Until next time, guys, be well. Welcome to Garden. Look to the skies, traveler.